Even for India, I think Russia brings stability, it's fine. But this is not a solution. And I think that's why the tension between the short-term stability and the long-term need for social change and democratization, that I think that problem will remain.
In this week's Raja Mandala, you've looked at taking off from Kazakhstan and then the turmoil in the former Eastern Bloc and the former Soviet republics, apart from Russia, from Ukraine and Belarus to, of course, Kazakhstan, where recently there's been a lot of protests and Russia was called in to provide security under an old alliance, which is never, I think this was the first time they've actually sent troops on the ground under that old security treaty for former Soviet republics. So the big question is what you point out. There was this sense right after the Cold War ended and right when Russia disintegrated, the former Soviet Union collapsed, that was a region of great instability. There was a shock doctrine kind of, the sale of assets, grave inequality, these countries sort of being on the path to being failed states, and that was then subsequently has been arrested. How do you see this recent turmoil in the region, particularly in Kazakhstan, in that light?
No, I think when we look back, I think the presumed stability of these republics was quite illusory. What you had was the strong men ruling these countries, absolute, autocracy. There's no other word for it, and it was also kleptocracy. I think if you hear the slogans of people today, that here was a country, Kazakhstan, just 19 million people, a very rich country, natural resources. It is not too hard, you presume, to be reasonably nice to the most sections of the society. But that's not what they did. And I think Nazarbayev, the president since 91, was really a Soviet era leader. Just took advantage of the gains that were coming to the society, to the state. And I think at some point this was bound to have an effect. The situation is been similar. Similar events have happened in other countries in Central Asia, even in other Eurasia as well. We talk about Belarus again, a strong man, Lukashenko, who calls himself Europe's last dictator. That they thought, they can simply get away with it. That there was no, that the people will simply accept. There have been mass protests, but I think Russia had to step in both the places to stabilize it. But even for Russia, this can't be a lasting arrangement that you simply support strong men because they're with you and they're against the West. But the question of domestic political transformation, do you do something about it, or you simply leave it to this kind of continued instability? And I think that is the big question for Russia.
So, one of the things you point out in the piece is that, say Eastern European countries which are part of the EU have still got instability and not quite happy there. So, and Europe and China, both despite their far superior economic resources compared to Russia, do not seem to be able to do what Russia is doing or has been capable of doing in terms of actually providing stability and security in a very real sense. Do you think and now with the dialogue with the West over Ukraine and over where that line is going to be for NATO to expand and Russia's role, do you think that this is also Moscow trying to maintain its independence and assertion vis-a-vis China as much as the West? Because there is a certain, in this kind of security environment, because China is the behemoth in the neighborhood now.
Yeah, I think first on the question of Europe, I think it's not just the strongmen who have failed. The attempt, the conviction that Poland, Hungary, and much of Eastern Central Europe have transitioned to liberal democracy. But again, I think, this kind of a sweeping propositions that became so popular after the Cold War, those again are being challenged in Central Europe. Today, both in terms of the resistance to the European Union, they feel as second-class citizens in the European Union. Then there is a cultural clash between the kind of norms that European Union and Western Europe want to impose, while slightly more conservative societies where religion is a strong force, they want to say, look, we must defend our culture. So defense of culture, cultural sovereignty, religious sovereignty, as opposed to the godless secularism that the EU might be imposing. So there is a tension even, in these societies which are now become part of the West. But the forces of conservatism of religion have not disappeared even there. So I think the contradictions remain there. So I think what it tells us, look, we need to be a lot more humble about the kind of sweeping judgments and propositions we made about the world. That what stands out for me, at least, that you can't force societies to evolve. I mean, whether it is the socialist modernization of the communists, or whether it is the liberal democratization of the West, societies are going to take the time to come through and adapt to it. Russia, for now, is taking advantage in the near term. But I think they have a problem too. I mean, Russia itself, if transition is so difficult in Kazakhstan, what happens when Putin, the strong man, how does he organize a sensible succession in Russia? So those issues are there. So we shouldn't take too much of a geopolitical view that, we are with this side and not that side. It is a question of social evolution, political trajectory. Those certainly matter. Second, I think the question you asked about China is very important, because what we've seen is, because of its problems with the West, Russia has moved steadily closer to the Chinese. And the Russians and the Chinese thought, they'll get together and do things together with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They will jointly develop a regional framework that will resist Western interventions and create a, color revolutions, what was called, promoting democracy from outside. But the problem, as you saw, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has not been much of use. They've had no role in this crisis in Kazakhstan. It was really Russia that did it. So what we've seen in the last 20 years, certainly the Chinese economic influence has grown. So while Russia has been working with the Chinese, it is of some concern to them that China does not undermine their primacy in Central Asia. But the current crisis has shown us that however much countries like Kazakhstan want some autonomy from Russia, which is natural, just as in South Asia, our neighbors want more autonomy from us. Similarly there too. But in the end, the geography ties them to the Soviet Russia. So therefore, it is a complicated love-hate relationship, if you will, between Russia's periphery and Russia. So I think we see that tension is not going to disappear. Whether it is Nazarbayev or somebody else, that problem will endure.
One of the things, final question, you touched on it just now, but there is in relatively, let's say, conservative societies or more religious societies, it's been the Orthodox Church in Russia, the Catholic Church in other parts of Europe, and Islam in certain parts of Central Asia. With the Taliban now having had this, as you mentioned in the piece, there is a triumphant, everyone should read the piece, by the way, it has a lot more detail. It is on the indianexpress.com, of course, and probably in the description, wherever you're watching this video. But so in that, is there a danger that this unrest, we saw it to some small extent, at least in the Arab Spring as well, is that unrest over inequality and over autocracy? Popular movements don't seem to have even a medium-term ideological lens or a secular ideological lens through which to articulate that kind of politics. And because it's no longer the Soviet Union, Russia itself is not exactly committed to, in that sense, an ideological worldview anymore, whether it's communism or democracy, liberal democracy. How do you see this kind of politics? Is this a recipe for just sort of continuing unrest, and it'll have to be a top-down system in that case, in these countries?
Yeah. See, that's what has happened. I think you have this spontaneous, reactions where people feel the oppression, react to it, like we saw in Belarus a few months ago, massive public demonstrations on an election they claimed was stolen by the president. And in Kazakhstan, after 30 years of one-man rule, there are protests, but there's still no cohesion. This is not an organized movement. There are a whole lot of groups that have penetrated the movement, obviously. So I think what happens in this kind of situation, the Western export of democracy model is not strong enough to really to take root, or the West does not have the stamina to do it. We've seen that in Afghanistan and Iraq. You can't do it beyond a point. And domestically, the capacity of the society to organize itself into political formations and autonomously generate social change, which is what most societies have to do for themselves. But these are historically, weak civil societies, and how do you organize that? that is a problem. And that's why this opens a fertile ground for religious forces. But there you put God into the equation. It's fairly easy to generate loyalty, to support, to tap into the deep, religious sentiments in Central Asia, which were kind of smothered by the Soviet Union and have largely remained dormant. But if the state does not provide, if the Western liberal democracy is not capable of really engineering change, where do you turn to? That will be the big problem. And if the situation in Afghanistan, then you had a whole lot of Turkey has this political Islamic agenda. They might do things. Iran has its own, ideas of Islamic revolution. So it makes Central Asia vulnerable. And I think that's why, for now at least, everyone says it's better Russians control it. Even for the Americans, having the Russians do this gives near-term stability, but it doesn't give you long-term answers. For China too, it's better the Russians do it rather than the Americans do it. So for now, it's everyone is even for India. I think Russia brings stability. It's fine. But this is not a solution. And I think that's where the tension between the short-term stability and the long-term need for social change and democratization, I think that problem will remain.
Right, sir. Thanks so much, everyone. Read the article on theindianexpress.com. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much.